Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, as I'm sure you have worked out, is a book that explores slavery. As it says on the back, it's a terrible, unspeakable things have happened to Seth at Sweet Home, the farm she lived as a slave for so many years until she escaped to Ohio. Her new life is full of hope, but 18 years later she's still not free. Her new home is not only haunted by memories of her past, but also the ghost of her baby who died nameless and whose tombstone is engraved with a single word, beloved. So Morris opted to put in two dedications. The first one is 60 million and more. And she has dedicated this book, therefore, to victims of 2 centuries of slavery, to the slaves who died. So this is a novel that has been dedicated to the dead. She dedicates the book to the ones who did not escape. The drowning, the disease, the sharks, the whipping, the mutilation, the burning, the boiling, the rape, the emasculation, the starvation, and any other horror you can think of. And why has she opted for 60 million and more? Well, Morrison said herself, I didn't want to leave anybody out. So this novel is looking at, it's an example of historical fiction and also a gothic horror. It fits in very well with the supernatural because it is exploring, as we've seen, ghosts and the idea of the supernatural and memories. And the key term, I think, in this text is rememory, and the idea of how memory is so important and how we remember memories. It could also be regarded as a Bildungsroman, which is a coming-of-age novel, because we look at not only Beloved coming of age, we also look at Denver coming of age, and in a way Sether. It certainly mimics the oral tradition and is told in the form of flashbacks and memories and nightmares. The whole book itself is an extended metaphor. There's lots of inner dialogue, and again, it's based on the story of Margaret Garner, who was a Kentucky slave, and she murdered one of her 4 children in 1855. So it is quite poignant, and it is based loosely on a factual story. The second dedication, of course, is the verse from Romans 9:25, which is, I will call them my people which were not my people, and her beloved which was not beloved. So this is an epigraph which sets the tone for the opening chapter, and the opening chapter is obviously where we have a willful ghost destroying Sether's home, a home that is free of slavery, but still laden with servitude's emotional baggage. Okay. In fact, Paul D's words are very wrathful and forbidding in certain aspects, but they contain Paul's, as in Paul, the Apostle Paul, sorry. Senior moment there, apologies. Romans 9 was written by the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul, interestingly enough, before he wrote Romans and before he became a convert to Christianity, was called Saul, and he was one of Rome's biggest persecutors of Christians. However, on his road to Damascus, and this is where we get the idea of you had your road of Damascus moment. On his road to Damascus, he is faced with God. God comes down, speaks to him, and he realizes how awful he's been, and he changes. And he writes a lot of books in the Bible. And in terms of books, what most of these were just in the AD was they were letters written to churches in certain places. So like Romans was a letter written to the church in Rome. Corinthians were letters written to the church in Corinth. So that's where the names come from. So in Romans 9, Paul has written letters to remind evolving Christians that they receive God's love through grace. The idea of grace means that we don't deserve God's love, but he loves us anyway. So although the people of the Roman Church were rebellious and unruly, God certainly allowed them and bestowed upon them glory because of his love for them. And these were people who were not truly fit to be loved. And if you look at the word beloved, it comes of be loved. Okay, so Morrison's epigraph is a fitting opening because, of course, this novel is about grace and love and forgiveness. Right, so when we look at Paul's words, which are wrathful and forbidding in certain respects, they also contain this promise. And he says, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. So really, what Paul is saying to the Romans is either ship up or shape up or ship out, because God is coming back for the true believers, and he's going to gather them up. He's going to take them to heaven with speed and finality. So it's this idea that, you know, even those not deserving, and no human being, according to the Christian faith, is deserving, because we are all sinners. So we start off looking at this text in which Seth is clearly a sinner. I mean, she's a murderer, but yet she is still loved, and she is still encompassed by God's love. So interestingly, I think this this verse also draws out the irony of the name of the eponymous character, because of course beloved is called into being by her mother Setha, and of course the issue of calling and names and identity is central to the plot. By citing a New Testament passage which repeats ideas from the Old Testament without making any changes, because of course the New Testament, for example, would often make changes to Old Testament Jewish law. So in the Testament, it talks about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and the idea of getting revenge, whereas in the New Testament, that turns it on its head and says, love your brother as you've loved yourself, so and turn the other cheek. So the New Testament does tend to adapt certain old school ideas, but this is a text that it doesn't. So Morrison is creating uncertainty about the relationship between the past and the present, and we are reminded, therefore, that this is what the text is going to be about. In fact, critic Anne Tyler believes the text, beloved, is veiled in, quote, gauzy mists of magic.